first public kind of conversations we're having, because we think it's a really important piece of the work that is a lot of times put to the side, not prioritized, individualized, especially even though we come from collective communities, and we have our ceremonies, which are private, but how do we bring about collective liberation in our movement spaces as well, and learn trauma-informed skills and understandings and ways of being, because a lot of times the way that we've been raised in our in white dominated society gives us really not gives us, but like imposes these ways of being that we're not even aware of sometimes, and then we perpetuate or perpetuate harm on ourselves and then harm on
others. Get caught up in this, like, how do we actually unpack our intergenerational trauma and the ongoing effects of colonialism and capitalism, as Melina said, and start to value it within our movements. And I think some of the most, I don't even want to call them radical, because what's radical, like if you think about the word, which is like totally outside of the norm, is the systems of colonialism and capitalism are actually radically against life, against healing, against all of those things. And we need to return to the way things were for thousands upon thousands of years without locking ourselves into a static idea of what that is. And it's difficult. And so it's challenging things like the 40-hour work week. It's challenging the languages that we have. It's challenging what we resource, and moving away from hyper-productivity to like moving towards community relationships. Because some of the most beautiful changes we have seen, and some of the most radical even economic structures that we have seen, have actually come out of community healing and well-being, which then takes away from the dependency on the structures, the colonial empire structures of the healthcare system, of the social assistance system, because people are actively taking care of themselves, their family, and the land, and it actually transforms ecosystems. And you start to see this beautiful transformation that actually comes out of healing justice frameworks. It's not just about, healing ourselves, which is absolutely part of it. Just like we need individual rights, we also need collective rights. And that's part of this framework. So bringing healing justice into the practices actually helps the socioeconomic health of entire communities begins to shift when we begin to heal. And that becomes so necessary when we talk about where resources go. We can't just be going, oh, we're gonna build a structure for healing. What about what it's gonna take for those community members to come to that structure? How do we make sure there's childcare, food, resources to make sure that that person can get from point A to point B, which is the healing center? How do we ensure that they have enough food on their table when they go back home? And that is how we radically change what healing justice looks like. It's not about creating something and inviting people to come and expecting them to come. It's about radically transforming how we redistribute resources and wealth across the board.
I had to kind of sit with the concept of healing justice for a little bit. I'm more kind of siloed in this academic realm where we talk about participatory action research, community-based research, and a lot of these kind of more what the academy tends to call progressive type frameworks for conducting research with quote unquote vulnerable communities, especially those that are Indigenous. They tend to lead towards more of the social justice aspects and building capacity and supporting the community. But then again, they tend to leave out this concept of healing. And they also have this really terrible tendency to position the researcher as objective. I myself have really struggled with that. I cannot silo my experience as an intergenerational residential school survivor with complex post-traumatic stress disorder as an objective person doing Indigenous research. those two things are not separate, they are the same thing. So when I'm doing my work, I have to start to weave this concept of healing that I'm doing independently and eventually in more of a community setting within the research that I'm doing, because I have to acknowledge not only my own trauma and my own suffering, but those of the people that I will potentially be working with. And to not do that, I think, is incredibly harmful. And so I'm starting the process of pushing back on that tendency of the academy to basically, blindfold people and gag them from saying that they even have issues. So I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm glad that we can kind of put a framework towards this, and hopefully we can start doing this in the academy, because it's completely necessary. Being in community with one another and laughing and sharing stories and knowledge. So these things are part of kind of my ethical framework that I'm starting to put together to better work with the people that I intend to work with, and to better support myself and acknowledge that I come to this work as a traumatized person, and I can't ignore that. None of us can ignore that. So how do we heal in a cultural way, in a way that validates our culture and supports one another? Because I can't just extract knowledge and data from people and expect that I've helped them in some way. I have to, and I feel obligated very much to help foster healing in the people that I work with.
Healing is truly found and is rooted in community. That's something I've learned a lot through the work that I've been studying about food systems and food work, and how when Indigenous women and women of color come together in food spaces, they become safe spaces and havens to talk about not only what they're learning about and their intergenerational knowledge, but talk about their personal traumas or their intergenerational traumas or their ancestral traumas, and connect with that over food, and not only over the process of creating food, but then cooking that food and serving that food. It's a really beautiful healing process. And I think healing does not look like one thing. It's a very multi-dimensional thing, and it definitely depends on your cultural backgrounds. But I definitely think it also is rooted in working with a variety of diasporas. I've found a lot of healing in just being around other people of color, being in this kind of space with a lot of Indigenous people, even though I am non-Indigenous. Just as a person of color, I find a lot of healing in being in communities of color, connecting and finding the similarities that we have across different diasporas and being able to relate to each other.
I grew up on the lands of the Lower Tanana Dene in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I am a white settler colonizer to these lands that I call home, and seeking to live in right relationship with the communities that I live in and the people whose lands I live on has led me to this work of healing justice and economic justice. And I'll keep my comments brief, but I do want to just share how, especially in Alaska with such a strong dependence on extractive industries, part of healing all of our relationships to the land and each other requires a shift in economic systems.
That's part of the issue with the word resilient, is it's, like this resiliency to change. You're so resilient to trauma. It's like, well, we have these core adaptations and ways of thinking that help us to be malleable. But part of that isn't supposed to be retrospect response, like healing. A lot of our healing is actually futurespect, where we head off challenges or things before they even happen, right? And so we need to help translate what does it mean to be adaptable in law and policy.